Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Schneider and today I'm going to present on the readings of Kukkonen and Bukatman and I'm going to apply them to the movie Batman Begins. In her article Navigating Infinite Earths, Karen Kukkonen talks a lot about the ideas of parallel universes and multiverses, and she starts off by saying that the ideas of parallel universes are very difficult to process, and this is why we construct mental models to eliminate alternatives and create coherence. In the superhero genre, though, different story worlds of multiverses are a given, and it can be challenging to navigate through the different realities, and Kukkonen explains the means of how readers do so. Kukkonen goes on by explaining that creators of superhero comics deploy a range of strategies that make navigating through the different multiverses possible for the reader. The first strategy is creating mental models, the second one is continuity and counterfactuals, the third one is the use of iconography, and the fourth one is reader surrogates. In the following, I'm going to evaluate each one of those strategies and explain more details to them. The first strategy that I'm going to talk about is the strategy of mental models. Therefore, comics are a medium employing three modes of expression. The first one is words, the second one images, and the third one is sequence. All of those three work together in constructing mental models. So basically, in order to understand what's going on in between the different parallel universes and multiverses and all kinds of story worlds that happen in the superhero genre, the reader creates mental models in his mind that help him or her to navigate through them. And therefore, visual clues are integrated into a broader model of the world of the narrative, and they are not treated as reproductions of features of that world. The illustration of events on a page of comics does not need to be continuous in order for us to develop a coherent mental model of those events, and the readers scan both images and words for information as they imagine the story world, and both provide clues of how to build a story world. Continuing with the concept of mental models, mental models are a concept that we use in order to draw inferences about what has happened in the story and in order to project what is going to happen in the story. And this means that continuity of the story a comic tells is not necessarily provided by the coherence of its clues, but mostly by the mental model readers construct on the basis of the textual clues. After the mental models, according to Kukkonen, continuity and counterfactuals are the next big strategy that help readers to navigate through the different parallel universes and multiverses that are created in the superhero genre. And this chapter explores challenges and the alternative realities of the multiverse pose for the construction of mental models. Therefore, our reasoning is based not only on mental models, but also on our negotiation of different counterfactual possibilities. And this is not that easy because the more counterfactual scenarios we construct, the more difficult it becomes to process them in our working memory. This means that we need a baseline reality in order to determine the counterfactuals of the multiverse. In the next chapter, the author focuses on iconography and how iconography is used to help the reader find their way through the different challenges that are presented by knowing your way around when it comes to parallel universes and multiverses. And this means that the superhero comics need to provide a way for readers to keep the character versions distinct and to relate each version to its own story world. Iconography refers to the visual attributes with which one can identify characters and allegories. Creators of superhero comics have developed their own iconography of costumes and visual attributes, which can be used to identify character versions and their story worlds. And the last big tool that is presented by the author that helps the reader to not go crazy with the different parallel universes and multiverses in the superhero genre are reader surrogates. And those are specific textual strategies that provide a sure footing for their readers, basically characters who function as reader surrogates, and they provide a physical path that connects story worlds. And the reader surrogates can form a replacement for the lost baseline reality of the multiverse. This means that the surrogate's path through the multiverse limits the number of alternative story worlds with which readers need to be concerned. I found it pretty hard to apply this topic to Batman Begins, and this is mostly because there's no real multiverse or parallel universe in Batman Begins. It all takes place in one timeline, and there are a couple of flashbacks, and those scenes are basically from different story worlds, where Bruce Wayne as a child is the surrogate that helps the viewer to keep the orientation. And even though there were not many scenes where the concepts can be applied in Batman Begins, in Warren Ellis's Planetary, a partial multiverse collapse fused different story worlds together, and they encountered with different Batman stories. And in those different Batman stories, each Batman acts like the original one, which helps the reader to depict the multiverse. So now we come to the next reading, which I found really enjoyable. The reading is called A Song of the Urban Superhero by Scott Bukatman. And the author talks about the connection between urban cities and superheroes. And he explains that in the mid 1980s, creators began to explore the relation between heroic figure and urban ground in the 1980s. And he says that the city became more than just a generic background for the superheroes. The author also describes a typical superhero story the following way. First, there's a superhero who is a figure of great independence and who chooses to serve the laws and morals of our society. And he lives in an urban city because that's where the criminals are. He operates beyond the law and he supports the law but remains uncorrupted. The author goes on and says that the superhero city is founded on the relationship between grits and grace. So superheroes are physically graceful, but they are also graced through their freedom, their power, and their mobility. And there was a nice quote that says, superhero comics embody the grace of the city, and superheroes are graced by the city. And through the superhero, we gain a freedom of movement not constrained by the ground level order imposed by the urban grid. Moving on, the author describes the phenomenology of superhero cities. He says that in fiction, journalism, and cinema, the uncentered city appeared as a dark maze or labyrinth in the 20th century. He describes that there are characteristic contrasts of the city. For example, those cities are familiar and strange, there is sunlight and shadow, they are bland and chaotic, and sublime and uncanny. And he notes that superheroes also embody these characteristic contrasts. One paragraph of the reading is called Flying in the City, and in this paragraph the author explains that superheroes have to be able to move, and that they move through space in 3 dimensions. And he also explains that cities are narrow and full of traffic, and in order to overcome this traffic, almost every superhero has enhanced powers of motion. As we all know, some superheroes are able to fly, some have super speed. In case of Batman, there's the Batmobile, etc. And he also notes that superheroes have to move efficient and fast. Another chapter from the reading that is called Masks and Capes is a chapter where the author talks about how superheroes are all about multiple identities. And he says that they embody the unstable self of sense that living in the city either imposes or permits. A nice quote that I found was that crowd becomes you and you wend your way through the crowd. And this is a strategy that Batman actually uses a lot in Batman Begins. And he learned it when he first received the training from Ra's al Ghul. And later on in the movie, he oftentimes uses this strategy as a weapon and he tries to become one with the crowd and with the people around him, and uses it as a surprise tactic against his enemies. And the author also states that superheroes play a continuous game of deception and duplicity that could only be played out in the city, and that most superheroes disguise themselves, just like Batman as Bruce Wayne, and how he uses his whole appearance and his cape and mask. To finish up my presentation, I'm going to talk about a chapter from the reading that is called Superhero City Tours. In this chapter, the author talks about several cities that superheroes live in, and he also talks about Batman's Gotham. And I'm going to use that right away and apply it to the movie Batman Begins. And the author explains that Gotham is very dark, narrow, crowded, airless, full of steel and concrete, and claustrophobic. And I personally think that this atmosphere of the city sets the tone in Batman Begins. And in addition to that, the author also notes that the city is defined by its underworld, that there's a huge concentration of hidden spaces, corners, and traps. And he also says that Gotham actually is a dark version of New York. And to finish everything up, I think that Batman's character is a reflection of the city. His childhood trauma stems from what happened in the city, in a corner. He has his fear of the dark also comes from the city, and it is reflected greatly by the city and the whole atmosphere. And he is also very chaotic in his actions, just like the city is chaotic and basically out of control. And that's it from my presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I can't wait to read all your comments and questions.